Demonstration Nugget, AWS Relational Database Service. Hey everyone, this is Ben Finkel, and in this nugget, let's launch the console and take a look at how we can spin up our own database inside of the Amazon cloud. We'll launch the database wizard on the management console and then step through the different pages there and review all the configuration options that we have for those databases. And then once that's done, we'll launch the instance and explore that instance inside of the management console, see all the different features and data that's available through the web interface. We're here at aws.amazon.com, and I'm going to choose to sign into the console, and we'll sign in with my IAM user, who has the appropriate rights to administer RDS instances. Now you find RDS exactly where you would expect to. There is a heading called Database on your control panel, and we select the RDS option. The first time you bring this up, you may get a big panel. You can see it here that says Get Started Now. This is because I don't have any RDS instances currently, and I can select Get Started Now to launch the wizard, or if I select Instances on the left-hand side here, I don't have any instances, I can choose to launch DB Instance. Either of those are going to bring me to this same page here, the DB Instance wizard. The first thing you get to do is choose what engine that you want to use. Here are the 6 engines that are currently available: Amazon Aurora, MySQL, MariaDB, Postgres, Oracle, and SQL Server. And you can see if you choose some of the simpler ones like Aurora or MySQL, you just choose that one instance, say select, and move on. Things like Oracle and SQL Server actually have a number of different versions associated with them. So you could actually choose SQL Server Express versus Web versus Standard Edition. I'm going to choose SQL Server Express just to pick one that I'm familiar with. The second page here, the second step in the wizard, is to specify the details of the database. And one of the things that I really like here is that I can check this only show options that are eligible for the free tier. When I do that, nothing appeared to change, but all of these pull downs are actually now limited to only free database options. That's kind of nice. That's going to keep me inside the free database tier. It's nice to be able to play around with it and know that I'm not going to accrue any charges. But here you can see the license model. The license is going to be included for this database engine, so I don't have to bring my own license to the table. My costs are already taking in the licensing into account. I can also choose from a number of different database engine versions here. You can see these are a number of different modern SQL Server database engine versions. And my instance class, the size of the virtual machine that this database is going to run on. So while I don't have any visibility or access to that virtual machine, that EC2 instance that this database is running in, I can choose how big I want it to be, specifically how many CPUs and how much RAM do I want. And I've only got a couple of really small options here because I have my free tier selected. Actually, if we unselect this, I'll just show you real quick. And then I pull down instance class. You can see there's a whole bunch more options, but I want to leave it checked to the free options so that I don't build up any charges while I do this. And then I have a storage type here. There are 2 options, SSD or magnetic. If I uncheck the free options, I could choose a provisioned IOPS drive as well, which will allow me to bulk purchase IOPS in advance at a lower cost and potentially save me money if I have a high usage database instance. Lastly here is allocated storage, and when I select it, you can see on the right hand side it says that 20 gigabytes is the maximum. That's because I have the free tier chosen. If I uncheck that, again, I could get a much higher or a much larger database size, but for the free tier, 20 gigabytes is as big as it's going to get. On the bottom half of the page are a few identifiers, specifically the DB instance identifier, and it indicates that this is going to be unique across all of my database instances in my account. So this is not globally unique, it's only account-wide unique. So we'll call this CBT RDS. A master username similar to my root user on my AWS account. This is going to be a root user for the database, the administrator for the database. And we're going to want to create this, set this up once, but we'll only want to use it for really administrative purposes. Probably the first thing that you would do after spinning up this database is create users inside of the database that had the appropriate permissions for whatever they needed to do, and then log in as those users, access the database as those users in order to move forward. Having filled out that information, I go to the third page, the last panel here, where I can configure a few advanced settings. And the first thing I'd like to highlight here is notice Microsoft SQL Server Windows Authentication. If I had an EC2 instance running a Windows Domain Controller, I could hook this database up to it and I could use Windows Authentication from that domain controller to authenticate users against this database. Obviously, that's a feature that's only available for SQL Server Engine databases. That's not going to work with, say, an Oracle database. So you can imagine that these advanced settings are going to change based on which particular database engine you're spinning up. Also, in order for this to work, it's got to be inside of the same VPC as that domain controller. And yeah, that's right, right up here at the top, we're choosing a virtual private cloud in order to put this database into. And it's going to create subnets for this database inside of that VPC. If you're unfamiliar with VPCs, check out the nugget on VPC that I did. But you can choose which subnet group you want, or you can create a new subnet group. You can choose whether or not it's publicly accessible, whether or not you want this database to have a public IP address. If it has a public IP address, then you can access it over the internet using that address and passing up your security credentials with a connection string. If you say no, then this database will only be available to EC2 instances or Elastic Beanstalk instances inside of your VPC itself. So you can expose it to the internet, or you can simply expose it to your own internal applications. That's completely up to you. Well, I'll say yes to give it a publicly accessible address. And then you can choose if you want which availability zone it should run in, or you can say no preference and let Amazon choose that for you. Down here are a few different database-specific options. You may recognize the database port if you're familiar with SQL Server, but that's literally the TCP port that the database is going to be listening for connections on. You can also choose DB parameter groups and option groups. I'll talk through those a little bit more in a few minutes here. But you can choose what the parameter settings are for this database. You specify them inside of a parameter group, and then you select this parameter group for the database. Same thing with the option group. Choose your backup retention period in your backup window. So here I've indicated that it's going to be retained for 7 days. It's going to retain backups. In my window, I can either say no preference, or more likely you're going to select a specific window, a window of time during which running the backup will not drastically impact your user base. So if you know that, no one's using it at 4 a.m., I can say for half an hour at 4 a.m. my database is going to back up, and that's going to have minimal impact on my users. Once you're comfortable with all of your configuration settings, you say Launch DB Instance, and we'll see that this is going to spin up and create a DB instance for me. I can click the button to view my instances, and here it is creating. Now, while this database is creating, and that will take a few minutes for SQL Server, it's not exactly a famously fast engine, I can still look at some of the details yet. Notice, first of all, the endpoint here is not available yet. So once the database is finished being created, I'll get a public endpoint that I can use in my connection strings in order to access this database. Over here on the left, I can choose the Configuration Details tab, and here are all the different configuration details that we set up, and everything's kind of nicely hyperlinked. So if I want to go to the VPC, I can click this VPC here. If I want to look at the subnet, I can click that here, etc., and so forth. I talked about the option groups briefly. You can see here on the left we have option groups and parameter groups right here. So if we select parameter group, we'll see it created a default SQL Server 12.0 parameter group. That's the database engine that I spun up. And if I click this little go to details page here, you can see all of these different parameters that have been configured. These are all sorts of different options that you can set up on this database engine. This is a group of parameters that have been set up by default. If I need to change any of these, I could create a new parameter group, or I could change them right here. And then I could apply that parameter group to that database, and that would apply these configuration settings to that database. So you have a lot of configuration options with something like SQL Server and Oracle. This is where you set all those up. This is how you maintain all of those different configuration options. And by the way, if a configuration option is not available here in the parameter group or option group, then it's probably not accessible via Amazon RDS. We're just going to wait a few more minutes for this instance to finish creating, and then we'll take a look at the final details for it. So after a few more minutes of waiting, I can now see that my SQL Server Express status is available. And if I expand it out, well, there's my endpoint right there. Notice that it's a domain name on port 1433. That's the port that I chose to listen to. And it's not an IP address. Even though this does have a publicly available IP address, it's very important that we connect to it using this named endpoint. And the reason for that is that if we want to set up a multi-availability zone deployment where our database has an automatic failover to a secondary standby database, well, that'll happen automatically as long as we're using this named endpoint. If we set up that multi-AZ deployment and we're using this named endpoint and our primary availability zone goes out of commission for any reason at all, it will fail over to that secondary zone, and this endpoint will continue to work as is. I won't have to change my code. I can also see lots of good data underneath the monitoring section here about how much memory I'm using, how much storage, and how much CPU I'm using, my IOPS. Everything that's going on with this database is available right here inside of this control panel. Underneath my instant actions, I can choose to create a read replica if I had the proper database engine chosen for that. I can also take a snapshot, which, similar to a snapshot of an EBS volume, is going to give me a point-in-time copy of this database that I can restore elsewhere. I can download to my own local database server. I can put it up inside of another DB instance to use for, I don't know, for testing or to do some reporting that may not need to be exactly up to date. And lastly, most importantly, when I'm done with this database, if I'm truly done with it, I can choose to delete the database right here under Instance Actions. This is pretty neat. When I choose to delete it, it actually asks me if I want to create a final snapshot and what I want to name it. So it says, you know what? Create a snapshot. Just save this one last snapshot before you delete, and that way you'll have it in case you decide, oh, I didn't mean to delete it. You'll have that final endpoint snapshot. If I say no, it's not going to create that snapshot, and I got to acknowledge that everything's getting deleted and this database is no longer going to be available. Click delete and that database will start deleting. So that concludes this demonstration of the AWS Relational Database Service, or RDS. Just to recap, you can launch a database instance from any of the 6 database engines available in RDS very easily through the web console. Simply log in and choose the RDS option. The wizard will walk you through all of the configuration options that you have for the database engine that you chose, including engine-specific choices such as setting up read replicas or multi-AZ deployments, or even SQL Server authentication against a Windows domain controller. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.